By 1965, the Mamas and Papas had signed to Dunhill Records and began recording their first album. John Phillips, the group's leader, songwriter and arranger, had recently shifted from traditional folk to commercial pop music. Michelle Phillips, John's wife, a former model based in San Francisco, had been added to the lineup for both her looks and natural charisma. Cass Elliot was associated with the band for one reason: the lead singer of the group, Denny Doherty. Cass loved Denny from the moment she met him. In truth, she had no interest being in the band. She was reluctant to join the group, even though John begged her constantly. She'd bluntly told him, "I'm never going to be on stage with Michelle because I'm never going to let the audience see the obvious distinction between us." John argued, "Cass, this isn't a beauty contest. This is about the way we sound, the way we sing together." Cass would reply, "I just don't want to do it." In truth, musically, the Mamas and Papas wasn't what Cass wanted to do. She wasn't a folk singer, she was a Broadway performer. Michelle took to Cass straight away. When they first met, Cass told her about losing the part of Funny Girl to Barbra Streisand. Cass wanted to break into musicals, but Barbra Streisand was taking all the parts that she wanted. She told Michelle, "I auditioned, but they gave it to that bitch Streisand." Through their career, John and Michelle's relationship would be documented in their compositions. Often feelings of Michelle were expressed in woeful songs of distress, loneliness and pain. This mirrored the feelings of unrequited love Cass felt for Denny. John and Cass would butt heads throughout their entire career, though this was likely due to a clash of personalities. They were both similar in that they were hugely talented and willful, while neither of them was seen as conventionally attractive. In contrast, Denny and Michelle were both much desired for their image. In their entire career, the Mamas and Papas performed live together only 30 times. This year, an affair would see the Mamas and Papas potentially split up before their first album is even released. John would detail the affair on the album with mixed emotions, with both messages of anger, forgiveness, and promises of comeuppance. When people would ask John how he would write such personal things, he would state, "This is how we turn tragedy into publishing." The songs for the album had been written earlier in the year, some of them dated back as far as 1962. This is the story of the Mamas and Papas, if you can believe your eyes and ears.
I said, "Just write this down, you'll never regret it." And you can ask Michelle to this day, she's never regretted it.
By the summer of 1965, John, Michelle and Denny had amassed savings of over $7,000. They decided to escape their pressures and find inspiration, they would move away from New York City. To decide where they would go, Denny gave Michelle a dart. He told her to throw it at a map of the world. Wherever it lands, that will be their new home. Michelle throws the dart blindfolded and it lands in the ocean. Denny moves it across the map, stating, "And then they swam to the Virgin Islands." The group would now be moving to the Virgin Islands. Armed with $7,000 in cash and 50 tabs of acid, the three, with a group of friends and one of John's kids, packed for their trip to St. John. For the plane ride, John takes mescaline. In St. John, they soak up the tropical atmosphere, go snorkeling high on acid, and for breakfast, coconuts are chopped in half and poured full of rum. Some other changes begin while they're there. When Michelle and Cass had took acid together, Cass had told Michelle about how in love she was with Denny. In fact, the first time she'd ever met Denny, she'd loved him.
And he was just God to her.
It was at this point Michelle began to see Denny in a completely different way. On St. John, the beginnings of an affair between Michelle and Denny began. When Michelle tells John about her attraction to him, John thinks for a moment and then naively says, "He's not attracted to you." On the islands, they rehearsed many songs that will later appear on If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears. It was around this time Cass turned up on the island. She missed Denny and brought with her a big bottle of liquid LSD. That was all she had though. Cass's wallet had been stolen at the airport. As time went on, the group quickly blew through the 7,000. When they'd first headed there, Michelle had believed they'd live the rest of their lives on the Virgin Islands, but but now they were broke. They borrowed money from the locals and caused an issue with the governor. He saw them as bad news, and to add insult to injury, his nephew had taken drugs with them. It was definitely time to leave. Cass was the first to go. It was easy for her. She'd bought round-trip tickets, so it was just a matter of jumping on the next flight home. The others didn't have the plane fare. Scraping all the money they could get together, Denny, Michelle and John got as far as San Juan. The group of 8 sat at the airport with their luggage piled up. They hadn't washed for days. John wrote the ticket agent a check for their plane fare, but of course it bounced. It was a hopeless situation. Then they came up with a plan. There was a casino nearby. They could take what little money they had and turn it into enough money to get them back home.
I said, let's just go to the casino and take this money, just roll it and see where it goes, you know?
When they entered the casino, they decided to try their hand at craps, a game where a dice is thrown and the players bet on the outcome. Michelle had never been in a casino in her life. John gave her the dice and said, throw. She threw and they won. Then they won again and again. Michelle threw 17 straight passes. Any gambler familiar with the game knows the odds of this happening are astronomical.
Guys around us are making like 100 grand. Roll 'em, Blondie.
They went back to the airport and they'd won enough money to fly themselves back to New York first class. They wouldn't stay in New York long though. It was soon on to California. Due to their lack of money, they decided to travel by car from New York to California. John and Michelle dressed in their best clothes and went to a rental place. They hired a silver blue Cadillac limousine and stocked up on acid, marijuana and amphetamines for the trip. John, in fact, had driven across the country a few times, but never in such luxury and never so high.
6-7 days to get there. So we figured if we drive there in 3, we'll have the car for 4 days to drive around and do, which we did.
On the journey, they stuck flowers in the air conditioning vents, and when the acid hit, John saw the rain pour down the windshield in multicolours. Then he had to remind him it wasn't raining. In California, the group had one plan: to secure a record deal. They heard the Byrds on the radio and believed if the Byrds could have a hit, they could too.
And I know John must have gone, wow, if McGuinn can do it, anybody can do it, you know.
They first got in contact with Nick Vennett of Capitol Records. The problem was though, they needed cash, and John was insistent on this. They were flat broke. A small amount of money was exchanged that day, according to a source, around $1,500. It was basically a down payment, but what would follow would be a 10 grand advance. Nick Vennett first needed to sell his car to make the cash. After this, a friend convinced them to go and see Lou Adler of Dunhill Records. He was part owner of Dunhill. Cass accompanied them along to the audition, but was still reluctant to join the group. This changed when Cass saw the record contracts.
And you've never seen anybody join a group faster than Cass Elliot because, she was a very practical girl.
Lou Adler was so impressed by the audition, he later said, "I felt like what George Martin must have felt like meeting the Beatles."
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, they were unbelievable.
While negotiating, John informed Lou Adler that Nick Vennett of Capitol Records was interested. John told Lou Adler they were all but signed to Capitol Records. This helped negotiate a contract that was better than most of the artists of the time. They signed with Dunhill that day. Less than a week later, Nick Vennett contacted John and told him he'd sold his car and the advance was ready. John had to apologise and tell him they were now signed to Dunhill. The record company also financed a house for the group to move into. It was decaying and green. They called it the Greenhouse. With the advance Dunhill had given them, John bought an old Buick convertible. They called it Harold the Bleak. The Beatles were playing the Hollywood Bowl that summer. The group couldn't afford tickets, but they drove down in Harold the Bleak and found a spot where they could watch without paying. They were in awe of the group. John made them a promise. Within a year they'd play the bowl and they'd win a Grammy. One last issue before recording would begin. The group still didn't have a name. They were playing around with the Magic Circle, but after watching Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels refer to the women of the gang members Mamas, Cass proclaimed, "That's it, we're going to be called the Mamas." John replied, "We'll be the Poppers." And so, the Mamas and Poppers were born. Recording for If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears began on October 7th. They entered Western Studios on this day to cut their first single. Go Where You Wanna Go, John had written about Michelle's previous affair with. He'd written it on the car journey from New York to California. You gotta go where you wanna go, do what you wanna do, with whoever you wanna do. Michelle later believed the story had gave him an opportunity to write a commercial song. She would also say the lyric was very sorrowful for John to write. Michelle also stated that the message of the song was misinterpreted. Rather than the narrator giving permission for his lover to have affairs, the song was a message of forgiveness. It captured the spirit of the 1960s to the public who didn't know the story. At this point, John and Michelle were growing apart, while Michelle and Denny were growing closer. This time, the cover photo for the album was taken. The group were pictured sat in the bathtub of the greenhouse. A photographer from Dunhill snapped different pictures of the group looking for the right shot. The group began hiding from him, and he eventually found them in the bathroom. Michelle and Denny were pictured close together. Their affair had begun, but this was before, as Michelle would say, the shit hit the fan. Following that, they recorded the B-side to the single. Somebody Groovy was a recent John Phillips composition. Most likely, he wrote it in an attempt to relate to the youth, capitalizing on, at this time, the popular word groovy. An upbeat track, it details the narrator's search for someone he can connect with who will also inspire him. Emotionally and spiritually, he's searching for, as the lyric says, someone who's able to move me.
I need somebody groovy, someone who's able to move me, yeah.
The single is planned for November. In the studio, the group work 18 hours a session. John buzzes around the studio high on speed and acid. Lou Adler, who signed the band, works with them in the studio producing the song. He will produce every Mamas and Papas album thereafter. The studio engineers include Bones Howe. When Bones found out they were originally called the Magic Circle, he felt it was a far better name than the Mamas and Papas. The Magic Circle, he felt, described the group perfectly. Session musicians are also brought in to work on the arrangements with John. The lineup, among others, was Hal Blaine on drums, Larry Nectar on keyboard, and Joe Osborne on bass. They'd record the backing tracks, then the group would add the vocals afterwards. The direction of the album is decided by both John and Lou. Lou taught John all about the music business. After the sessions end, John stays late with Lou. John was consumed with their first album, and besides, he didn't have enough money to go partying. With their first single finished, it will be a month until the group will return to the studio to begin on the tracks for the album. On November 4th, the group returned to Western Studios, not to record their own tracks, but because Lou Adler had secured them work adding vocals on Barry Maguire's album. Maguire was their friend and also signed to Dunhill. John was giving one of his songs to Maguire, and because it was John's composition, he was there to give advice on the arrangement. The other Mamas and the Papas were in Western to record some backing vocals to some of Barry's songs, which would feature on his second album, This Precious Time. John strummed through California Dreamin' on acoustic guitar. Phil Sloan, a songwriter who was directing Maguire's session, loved the lyrics and the vocal melody, but felt a folk song was passé. He insisted adding a surf sound to bring it up to date with what was on the charts. Dunhill needed a hit for Maguire. Sloan changed one of the chords John was playing and insisted they have an intro that stands out, something, he said, like the Byrds' Tambourine Man. Sloan picked up an acoustic guitar and quickly came up with the legendary intro. After that, they cut the backing track with a group of session musicians, and Barry Maguire added vocals to his new single, California Dreamin'. When all was complete, they went into the control room and listened to the playback. it was astounding. Lou Adler took John aside and told him, "You can't give this song away." John then told Barry Maguire it might make more sense for the Mamas and Papas to record this song. Barry shrugged and replied, "Sure, it's your song, you wrote it." Barry's vocals were erased and Denny's were added instead. Though, if you listen closely to a stereo cut, you can still vaguely hear Maguire's vocals. Side note, when Barry's album was released in January of the next year, it featured his cut of California Dreamin'. The track featured the exact same backing track with added backing vocals by the Mamas and Papas. California Dreamin' had been written years previous while Michelle and John were living in New York. Autobiographical, they'd been walking when they came across a church, St. Patrick's Cathedral. Michelle was awed by the grand building. She said to John, "Let's go inside," to which John replied, "No, I don't want to go inside, you go." Michelle kept pushing him, but he flat out refused. John had a bad relationship with religion. He'd been forced by his parents into a Catholic military school at the age of 7. He hated the military and he hated religion. This can be heard in the song with the lyric, "I got down on my knees and pretend to pray." When California Dreamin' was complete, Lou Adler decided to put a halt on their single, "Go Where You Wanna Go." It was a smart decision to release California Dreamin' instead. It was at this time John discovered Denny and Michelle were having an affair. He marched into the room where they were and shouted, "Alright, what the fuck is going on with you two? We better sort this shit out now." Denny nervously explained what was happening and John replied, "I just wish I knew before we signed the contracts." They were in fact now in a 5-year contract. Michelle asked, "Well, what are we going to do?" John told her he was getting out of the greenhouse immediately, moving into a place of his own. Either she could come with him and it's fine, or stay there and it's over. Michelle looked at Denny for an answer and then back at John. Denny finally said, "Go with John." She did. John and Michelle would find a place on Lookout Mountain Road in Laurel Canyon. When Cass awoke from the argument and wandered in, she was horrified at what had happened. She adored Denny and felt betrayed by Michelle. She stated, "You could have any man you want. Why did you have to take the one that I'm in love with?" Michelle had no answer. Cass was so angry with Denny, she didn't want to live with him and decided to move out. Cass also moved into Laurel Canyon, renting a place on Kirkwood Drive. Denny was left alone in the greenhouse. Not for too long though. He too moved to Laurel Canyon, into a place on Woods Drive. By the time If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears would be released, the cover was somewhat outdated. The four had split apart and moved out of the greenhouse. It was decided at this point to put their personal problems aside. No one wanted to create waves now, not when they were just about to take off. 4 days later, on the 8th of December, the group's single California Dreamin' is released. On the 11th of December, the group performed live for the first time. They perform on Shindig at ABC Studios in Hollywood. The group nervously perform as backing singers to Barry Maguire, who sings Yesterday, Do You Believe in Magic, You Gotta Hide Your Love Away, and others, before moving on to their songs. The Mamas and Papas perform 3 of their own, California Dreamin', Somebody Groovy, and I Call Your Name, though this version is different to what will later appear on the album. Back in the studio on December 16th, they begin on their next song, Monday Monday. John wrote the song Monday Monday with the aim of having a universal appeal.
Jenny was over and Jenny was like yelling at me about writing songs. "Why don't you write some more songs? We need some more songs." I said, "Okay, I'm going to sit down and write his song tonight about a universal subject."
Michelle hated the song. When John first read out the lyrics, "Monday, Monday, can't trust that day. Monday, Monday, sometimes it just turns out that way," Cass and Michelle both started laughing. John felt insulted and snapped, "That's a good lyric." Cass replied, "John, it's not a good lyric. It's a horrible lyric." Nonetheless, John forged on with the song, and when the group sang it for Lou Adler, he stated, "Wow, that's great. Let's record it today." Michelle was still opposed to the song, but she sang on as instructed.
Oh, Monday morning, couldn't guarantee.
Next, they begin work on the first cover song for the album, Do You Wanna Dance? The song expresses a longing for connection and joy. Denny takes the lead vocal.
Do you wanna dance and hold my hand? Tell me I'm your lover, man.
In the studio, John sits in the booth and gives directions to Denny, mainly about phrasing, like he often did. John also gives Cass direction. They all listen closely and take John's comments on board. As it nears Christmas, the group are driving through Laurel Canyon in Harold the Bleak, up to John and Michelle's house, when they hear California Dreamin' on the radio for the first time. They were in hysterics, but then they heard nothing of the song for a month. John and Lou then decided maybe they should put out Monday, and then California Dreamin' shot up the charts. At this time, the Mamas and Papas perform on TV again. Filmed at KABC Studios in Hollywood, they run through California Dreamin' and Somebody Groovy. On the 29th of December, the group begin the second cover for the album, I Call Your Name. The song's basically Cass's love letter to John Lennon. Cass literally calls John's name in the middle of the instrumental. Cass adored John Lennon. She was madly in love with him, very much like she was with Denny. Some pointed out Denny shares a resemblance to John. John Phillips takes the role as taskmaster through the recording. He forces the group to redo takes. When Michelle complains, saying her voice is fine, he replies, "No, it's not. You were flat." After redoing it, Michelle later admits he was right. Next, they begin on John and Denny's song Got a Feelin'. When they first moved from New York to LA after leaving the Virgin Islands, there was an incident in which John, clearly suspicious of Michelle and Denny, began creeping into the room they were in. Inside, Michelle was feeding Denny fruit, and on hearing John outside, she ran out of the house and into the street. She was, in fact, still wearing her pajamas. Got a Feelin' was written about John's suspicions. He actually wrote the song with Denny.
I got a feeling and things like I always like would write songs sort of on that, and then we all had to sing them, you see. That was my revenge.
The song opens with the lyrics, "Got a feeling I'm wasting time on you, babe. Got a feeling you've been untrue."
Got a feeling that I'm wasting time on you, babe.
The song ends with the unfaithful party due a comeuppance. As they record, it's obvious to the group the song is referring to Denny and Michelle's affair. Michelle at the time was not enthusiastic about the song. She later stated, "It's like, okay John, aren't we living this already? Do we have to record it now and make a record out of it?" A turning point for the group came when they recorded this song. The track begins with Michelle and Cass singing together. This was the first time in the studio John had to scold Cass. The two were attempting the vocal for Got a Feeling, but it didn't sound right. John broke down and told Cass, "You must be able to blend with Michelle. You can't blast your voice, and Michelle can't sing so softly." They adjusted their vocals and blended perfectly for the first time. The ticking sound that plays throughout the track, which was assumed to be a metronome, was actually a harpsichord played by Larry Knechtel. Straight Shooter was another song John later said he wrote while the group were driving from New York to California. John was driving the limo at night. Michelle was curled up asleep in the front, and Denny was in the back. They were at this point passing through the Salt Lakes in Utah, driving about 80 miles an hour. The window was open, and the wind was blowing into John's face. He came up with the lyrics and had to stop the car and hear them out loud. John grabbed his guitar from the back seat, and on the side of the barren road, he worked out the chords. The phrase, straight shooter, Michelle believed at the time described an honest, straightforward person. Michelle believed John would never shoot heroin. Even Cass, when interviewed around the time, brushed off rumours the song detailed the story of a junkie. John wasn't touching heroin during this period though. He wouldn't even let a heroin user in his house. When John would later begin using heroin, Michelle would state she believed it was due to both the collapse of the Mamas and Papas and the collapse of their marriage. Denny sang the lead for the song like he often did.
Don't get me mad, don't tell no lie, don't make me sad, don't pass me by.
During their live performances, Denny was shy. He didn't talk much on mic. That was always left to John or Cass. Surprisingly, Michelle would also get nervous. At the end of a gig, she saw it as a good show if she could get through the performance without throwing up. Next, they begin Hey Girl, the first song to feature John on lead vocal. John hated his voice. He always mixed it down, added echo and compression, anything to enhance it.
Hey girl, I know he's put you down.
Michelle never liked the song. She later stated, it sounded artificial and didn't have any heart. The story follows a girl who's been hurt by a boy known for breaking hearts. The song implores her to move past the heartache and see her own self-worth. Before the song is recorded, it's rehearsed with just one guitar, never a band. John's theory is if it doesn't sound like a full band with one guitar and four voices, it never will. John never relies on the instruments to pick up the slack. On the 6th of January, the group record their next single, Spanish Harlem. A cover, the story tells of resilience and finding hope in a tough situation. The rose growing in the street being a metaphor for overcoming challenging circumstances.
There is a rose in Spanish Harlem.
In the sessions, when a 12-string acoustic features, it's actually John Phillips playing on the record. The session musicians remember him having a great touch and feel for rhythm, though he did fluff up a lot. John never had a grasp of the piano, so he left that to Larry Knechtel. He had a lot of involvement with the bass though. John was quick to say what he liked and didn't. The session player Joe Osborne would say, "Who is this guy? Who does he think he is?" At this point, the group were beginning to earn decent money from the sales of California Dreamin'. So much so, Denny and John went out and bought matching Triumph 500 motorcycles. Next song they begin, a cover titled You Baby. In my opinion, the best cover on the album. Originally written by the Vogues and popularised by the Turtles, the Mamas and Papas give a fine rendition. The story, a simple light-hearted romantic devotion, it celebrates the unspoken connection between two people. The album, there were a couple of songs short, so this helped fill it out. The backing track had already been recorded, writer of the song was working with them, and he gave the already recorded backing demo, so all they needed to do was add the backing vocals. Obviously, the writer now took royalties from the song. John added some overdubs, and it was a wrap. Next, they begin on the final song for the album, another cover titled The In Crowd, probably the most dated song on the album. The story follows a narrator seeking validation through popularity and following trends. The message, though most likely satirical, was seen as very superficial. The lyric reads, "I'm in with the in crowd, I go where the in crowd goes." Michelle later stated her daughter China once came up to her and said, "I heard a song today that really pissed me off." Michelle replied, "Oh, what was that?" China replied, "It's called In Crowd. What kind of bullshit is that?" Michelle replied, "I don't know, but we sang it on one of our albums." With the song wrapped up, the album is now complete. At this time, John reads about the Monkees' new film. He states, "Oh, the Monkees are going to do a movie." Cass replies, "Who cares? They'll have the money, but we'll have the legend." On the 29th of January, the group performed live on TV again for the show Hollywood Palace. They sing two compositions, California Dreamin' and Be My Valentine. A month later, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears is released. Strangely, Michelle's affair had a positive impact. It gave John something to write about. John himself said he couldn't write unless he writes about things that actually happened to him. He stated, "I was never very good when setting out with the plan, let's write something about this, or let's write something about that." Because the songs were so biographic, every time John finished a song, the rest of the group felt like they'd wrote it too. Cover songs on the album fit perfectly. They weren't out of place. They were both familiar and new. None can be more true than "I Call Your Name." John would say to the group, "Pick a song from your childhood that you would love to sing." He'd then make it sound like he wrote it. The Mamas and Papas were pioneers in creating contemporary music which appealed to both young and older audiences. It hit #1 on the US Billboard. They quite literally lived the rags to riches cliche, but there was a sense they were building their house on sand. There were issues that lingered over them. They could easily implode at the seams, but not before they cemented themselves as legends. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.